Is your buttercream usually a total mess? The number one struggle I always hear people talk about with their buttercream is that they can't get the right consistency. Either it's way too soft and runny, or it's way too firm or stiff, and either way, it just makes frosting your cakes and decorating them really difficult. So today I want to talk to you about buttercream consistency, how you can adjust it and fix your buttercream to get it to do what you want it to do. First, I just want to make sure that we're all on the same page here because obviously different types of buttercream are going to have different consistencies. Some types of buttercream are just naturally stiffer and easier to work with, while others are going to be a lot softer and they're really only meant for applying a light layer of frosting. So whatever recipe that you're using should usually tell you what the frosting's good for and whether or not you can decorate with it. And if it doesn't tell you that, you might want to get a different recipe. That being said, in this video, I'm only going to be talking about very general things that you can do to adjust the consistency of your buttercream. I'm not really going to be talking about altering recipes or specific recipes. So first, I want to break it into two categories. I want to talk about American style buttercream, which is usually just butter and powdered sugar, and then kind of everything else. So I'll leave timestamps in the description below in case you want to jump ahead to a specific part of the video. Also, while we're talking about different types of buttercream, can you leave a comment below and let me know what's your favorite type of buttercream to frost with or decorate with or just to eat? Just so I can get an idea and make more videos that will be relevant for you. All right, so let's dive into American buttercream first. And remember, this is going to be buttercream that's made with butter, powdered sugar, and then it usually almost always has milk and or heavy cream. And the way that you're going to adjust consistency for this type of buttercream is super easy. You're either going to add more sugar or you're gonna add more cream. If the buttercream is too soft, you're gonna wanna add a little bit more sugar. If the buttercream is too stiff, you're gonna go ahead and add a little bit more milk or cream or whatever liquid the recipe called for. Now, disclaimer, you do need to be a little bit careful when you start adding in more ingredients because the more that you change the amount of sugar or cream or whatever liquid you have, the more that you're going to be changing the texture and the flavor of the buttercream. But in general, with this style of frosting, it's pretty safe to play around with the ingredients. So just start small. If you need to adjust the consistency, do a spoonful at a time until you get it the way you want. Just don't dump in a bunch of sugar or a bunch of cream and then wonder why your buttercream is a mess. So adding sugar or cream are things that you're only gonna do for those American style buttercreams which already have those ingredients in them. Now for pretty much every other kind of buttercream that I know about, the number one thing that you have control over that's going to affect the consistency is the temperature. And I say thing that you have control over because remember, we're not talking about variations between different kinds of recipes. We're talking in general. After you've made a recipe, what do you have control over that's going to affect the consistency of your buttercream? So why does temperature matter so much? Well, if your buttercream frosting is either too warm or too cold for whatever reason, it's going to behave just like plain old butter would in those situations. So if your frosting is too cold, it's going to be really hard, just like cold butter, but if it's too warm, it's gonna be soft and melty and runny, just like warm butter. Adding on to that, the temperature of your buttercream is also gonna affect how much air you can whip into the frosting. And the more air that you whip into your frosting, the more light and fluffy and soft it's going to be. This is because butter has this magical temperature range and it's around 68 to 70 degrees Fahrenheit, which is I think around 20 degrees Celsius. But in this range, you can whip a lot of air into butter, but it's still going to hold its shape. So if you're below that range, what's gonna happen is your butter won't be as flexible and it won't be able to hold all those air bubbles that you whipped into it. And that's gonna give you a really dense, stiff buttercream. On the other hand, if your frosting is too warm, you're above that magic range, it's not going to be strong enough to hold itself up. It's just going to melt and collapse, and that's going to give you melty, runny, greasy buttercream. And just to really solidify this into your brain, I did a nerdy little science experiment and I actually weighed out a cup of buttercream at different temperatures to show you how much the temperature affects the consistency of your buttercream. All right, so let's look at a cup of buttercream that is at that magic temperature range. This buttercream is at 70 degrees Fahrenheit. So 1 cup of buttercream at 70 degrees Fahrenheit turns out to weigh around 160 grams. Now this is gonna vary again for different recipes. This is Swiss meringue buttercream, but you get the idea. Now let's compare that and look at cold buttercream. So this buttercream is at 63 degrees Fahrenheit, much colder than our magic range. And look, it weighs 192 grams. It's way heavier than the buttercream that was at that magic temperature range. On the flip side, now let's weigh some buttercream that's warmer than our magic temperature range. So this buttercream is around 83 degrees Fahrenheit, and it also is heavier than our magic temperature range butter, coming in at 180 grams. All right, so that was just a fun little science experiment that I wanted to try out, and this video was a great excuse for it, but you definitely don't need to break out your thermometer to get the right consistency buttercream. You just need to understand those principles. So if you notice that your buttercream is a little bit too stiff or a little bit too soft, all you have to do is adjust the temperature. If your buttercream is too stiff or too cold, what I like to do is remove a small portion and actually just melt it in the microwave. When you do this, only a few seconds are necessary. No more than 5 seconds to start off because it's gonna melt very quickly. Then all you have to do is take that melted portion and mix it back in with the rest of your buttercream. It might take a little bit of mixing, but that warm buttercream and cold buttercream should equalize and bring you back to the right consistency. For warm buttercream, you can actually just throw the whole bowl into the fridge for 10, 15, 20 minutes, depends on how melted it is, until it cools back down. When you're chilling buttercream like this though, just make sure that you scrape down the sides of the bowl really well and re-whip it, because the outer edges are gonna chill down and firm up a lot faster than the center. And if you do end up needing to chill your buttercream, don't freak out if you mix it and it starts to look a little curdled. That's totally normal. Just let it keep mixing and eventually everything is going to smooth out. So whether you are heating up your buttercream or cooling it down, just make sure that you do that gradually and gently. You can always repeat the process if it wasn't enough, but typically you really only need to change it a few degrees in either direction. All right, so we got temperature out of the way, and that is the big one, the big thing that really affects the consistency of your buttercream, but there are a few other things that can affect the consistency as well. Flavor additions are another big thing that can affect consistency. If you add a lot of liquid flavor or something that has a soft texture, that can really make your buttercream a lot softer, or it can even cause it to break. So I'm talking about things like liquid extracts, syrups, jams, fruits, anything like that. If you add too much of any of these types of flavorings, you can either end up with really soft buttercream, or you could even cause the buttercream to split and break apart, which will be a big mess. You can definitely add these things to your buttercream, especially if you're following a recipe, but just make sure that you're using them in moderation. And if you're trying to get a really strong flavor, go with more concentrated things like extracts, or you could even try powders. So instead of adding strawberry jam, you might want to add freeze-dried strawberry powder to get a lot more flavor without adding in all that extra liquid. Now there are other ingredients that you can add that will actually make your buttercream a bit firmer. Chocolate is the main one that I can think of. So if you add melted chocolate into your buttercream, at first it's going to be really soft because the chocolate is still warm. But as it chills down and comes back up towards room temperature, it's gonna behave more like chocolate would when it's at room temperature. It's gonna be a lot firmer. I've also found a similar thing happens when I add caramel to my buttercream. This is obviously gonna depend on the consistency of your caramel sauce, but if you add a really thick, gooey caramel sauce to your buttercream, it's gonna give a little bit more structure and kind of like a little bit more bouncy flexibility to your buttercream. That kind of sounds weird, but that's just what I've noticed. Either way, flavor additions will affect the consistency of your buttercream, so just make sure that you take that into account before you start adding things into a basic recipe. Also, the consistency of your buttercream is going to change if you've left it sitting around for a little while. This is something I found happens with most types of buttercream, either if I've stored them long term in the fridge or freezer, or if I've just let them sit on the counter for a few hours. They tend to develop a lot of large air bubbles and they're not as smooth and creamy anymore. So just make sure that whenever you're ready to start using your frosting, whether you're frosting a cake or you're going to be piping decorations, to re-whip it right before you're ready to use it. All right, now that you know all about how to fix your buttercream consistency, why don't you go check out my video all about how to stack a cake like a pro, and you will be ready to decorate the perfect cake. Thanks so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video.